They chuckled as he tightened bolts, his hands shaking with age. "Let the real mechanics work," someone whispered behind his back as he struggled with tools that seemed too heavy for his weathered fingers. The hangar was filled with young technicians who rolled their eyes every time the old man asked for help or moved too slowly around the massive fighter jet. But then the pilot stepped out from his briefing, paused mid-stride, and stared at something on the jet's wing that made his blood run cold. There, etched in fading ink, barely visible unless you knew exactly where to look, was a name that changed everything. The pilot's eyes widened as he read the signature, because this wasn't just any maintenance worker fumbling with wrenches. This was the man who had designed and built this very aircraft decades ago, when it was nothing more than blueprints and dreams. The same hands they mocked for being too old and shaky had once crafted every bolt, every wire, every system that kept pilots alive in the sky. The laughter died in their throats as words spread through the hangar like wildfire. Suddenly, no one was making jokes about the old man's trembling fingers or his slow, methodical approach to each task. Because what they had witnessed wasn't incompetence, it was the careful, precise work of a master craftsman who knew every inch of his creation. The pilot stood frozen, realizing that the man they had dismissed as past his prime was actually the legendary engineer who had saved countless lives through his innovative designs. But the old man just kept working quietly, methodically, as if nothing had changed. He didn't need their recognition or their apologies, because he had never forgotten what it meant to build something that would carry young pilots safely through the dangers of combat. And as the truth settled over the hangar like a heavy blanket, everyone understood that they had just witnessed something extraordinary, the reunion of a creator with his greatest creation. Welcome to Silent Salute. Before we continue this incredible story, tell us in the comments from which city in the world are you watching this video today? And if you think stories like this need to be heard, hit that subscribe button to support the channel. We're growing every day, and I sincerely thank you for being a part of it. The military airbase stretched across the desert like a small city, complete with runways that disappeared into heat mirages and hangars large enough to house commercial airliners. Edwards Air Force Base had seen decades of experimental aircraft and test flights where pilots pushed the boundaries of what was possible in the sky. On this particular morning, the hangar bay was busier than usual, with mechanics and technicians preparing for a critical test flight of a newly upgraded F-16 Fighting Falcon. The aircraft had undergone extensive modifications to its avionics and weapons systems, requiring careful inspection of every component before it could be cleared for takeoff. Among the bustling crew of young mechanics and engineers, there was one figure who seemed oddly out of place. Harold Mitchell was 73 years old, with silver hair that refused to stay combed and hands that showed the unmistakable tremor of advancing age. He wore the same standard-issue coveralls as everyone else, but somehow they seemed to hang differently on his slight frame, making him appear more like someone's grandfather who had wandered into the wrong building. The other workers had grown accustomed to his presence over the past few weeks, since he had been assigned to assist with routine maintenance tasks as part of a civilian contractor program for retired aerospace workers. What bothered the younger mechanics wasn't that Harold was old, it was that he seemed to approach every task with an almost painful deliberateness that slowed down their normally efficient workflow. When they needed to remove an access panel quickly, Harold would spend several minutes examining the screws before selecting the proper tool. When they rushed to complete pre-flight checks, Harold would insist on double-checking measurements and torque specifications that everyone else considered routine. His questions seemed endless, and his pace seemed glacial compared to the rapid-fire efficiency that modern aircraft maintenance demanded. The morning's work began like any other, with the crew dividing responsibilities according to their specialties. Jake Morrison, a 26-year-old avionics specialist, took charge of the electronic systems, while Sarah Chun focused on the hydraulics and flight controls. Tommy Rodriguez handled the engine inspection, while Marcus Webb managed the weapons systems integration. Harold was assigned to what everyone considered the least critical tasks, checking fluid levels, tightening access panels, and performing visual inspections that required more patience than technical expertise. As Harold shuffled around the aircraft with his clipboard and flashlight, the younger mechanics exchanged glances and barely suppressed smiles. Jake leaned over to Tommy and whispered that they should probably finish Harold's work for him, since the pilot would be arriving soon for his pre-flight briefing. Sarah suggested that maybe Harold should stick to paperwork since his hands shook too much for precision work. Marcus openly wondered why the contractor program couldn't find younger retirees who still had steady hands and quick reflexes. The comments weren't meant to be cruel, but they carried the casual dismissiveness that often accompanies generational differences in the workplace. The young mechanics had grown up with digital systems and computer-aided diagnostics, while Harold seemed to belong to an era of slide rules and paper blueprints. When he asked questions about modern avionics interfaces, they assumed he was struggling to keep up with technology. When he took extra time to examine components, they assumed he was being overly cautious due to diminished confidence in his abilities. Harold appeared oblivious to their whispered conversations and sideways glances. He continued his methodical inspection routine, checking each system with the same careful attention to detail that had characterized his entire career. He ran his fingers along wiring harnesses, looking for signs of wear or damage that might not show up on computerized diagnostics. He examined rivets and joints with a magnifying glass, searching for hairline cracks that could compromise structural integrity. His movements were slow but purposeful, guided by decades of experience that had taught him where problems typically developed. The irony was lost on everyone present that Harold's deliberate approach was actually more thorough than their rapid-fire efficiency. While the younger mechanics relied heavily on computerized systems and standardized checklists, Harold was performing the kind of comprehensive visual and tactile inspection that had been standard practice in the early days of aviation. He understood that computers could miss things that human senses could detect, and that some problems only revealed themselves to experienced eyes and hands that knew what to look for. As the morning progressed, the divide between Harold and the rest of the crew became more apparent. When Jake finished his avionics check in 20 minutes, Harold was still examining the same access panel he had started with an hour earlier. When Sarah completed her hydraulics inspection and moved on to flight controls, Harold was still checking fluid levels with a precision that seemed unnecessary for routine maintenance. The younger mechanics began working around him, treating him like an obstacle rather than a team member. The situation reached a breaking point when the hangar supervisor announced that the pilot would be arriving early for his pre-flight briefing. The crew needed to finish their inspections and clear the aircraft for final checks, but Harold was still working on what everyone considered minor details. Jake finally spoke up, suggesting that Harold had done enough and should let the Real mechanics finish the important work. The comment hung in the air for a moment before Harold simply nodded and stepped back from the aircraft without argument. Captain David Reynolds arrived at the hangar precisely on schedule, carrying his flight helmet and a folder containing the day's mission parameters. At 34, Reynolds was considered one of the Air Force's most skilled test pilots with over 2,000 flight hours in various aircraft types. He had flown combat missions in Iraq and Afghanistan before transitioning to experimental flight testing, where his combination of technical knowledge and flying skill made him invaluable for evaluating aircraft modifications and new systems. Reynolds approached the F-16 with the practiced eye of someone who had learned to spot potential problems before they became dangerous. He walked slowly around the aircraft, examining the exterior for any signs of damage or improper installation. His pre-flight inspection was as much about developing confidence in the aircraft as it was about identifying problems, since test flights often pushed aircraft beyond their normal operating parameters. As Reynolds circled the aircraft, his attention was drawn to something on the underside of the left wing. They're partially hidden by years of paint, and where was a small signature etched into the metal surface. The marking was so faded that it was barely visible, but Reynolds had learned to look for such details during his years of flying vintage and experimental aircraft. Maintenance crews and manufacturers sometimes left their marks on aircraft as a form of professional pride or historical record. Reynolds knelt down to get a better look at the signature, using his flashlight to illuminate the faded markings. What he saw made him freeze in place, because the name etched into the wing wasn't just any random marking. It was a signature he recognized from aircraft manuals and technical documents he had studied throughout his career. The name belonged to one of the most legendary aircraft designers in aviation history, someone whose innovations had revolutionized fighter aircraft design and saved countless pilot lives. The signature read Harold E. Mitchell, with a date from 47 years earlier, when this particular F-16 had rolled off the production line as one of the first aircraft in the Fighting Falcon program. Reynolds stared at the marking in disbelief because he knew that Harold Mitchell wasn't just any engineer, he was the principal designer of the F-16's revolutionary fly-by-wire control system. Mitchell had been responsible for developing the computer-assisted flight controls that allowed the F-16 to be inherently unstable, yet incredibly maneuverable, giving it advantages over every other fighter aircraft of its generation. Reynolds rose slowly from his crouched position and looked around the hangar until his eyes found the elderly man who had been working on routine maintenance tasks. The same Harold Mitchell whose hands the young mechanics had mocked for trembling was the genius who had designed the very systems they were working on. The man they had dismissed as too old and slow was actually the legendary engineer whose innovations had made the F-16 one of the most successful fighter aircraft in aviation history. The realization hit Reynolds like a physical blow because he understood exactly what this meant. Harold Mitchell wasn't just a retired aerospace worker helping with routine maintenance, he was one of the founding fathers of modern fighter aircraft design. His signature on the wing wasn't just a mark of pride, it was proof that he had been personally involved in building this specific aircraft when it was new. The hands that the mechanics had mocked for shaking had once assembled the very components they were now inspecting. Reynolds walked directly to Harold, who was quietly organizing his tools and preparing to leave the hangar. The pilot's expression was serious and respectful as he approached the elderly engineer. Harold looked up with the same quiet patience he had shown all morning, unaware that his identity had been discovered. Reynolds extended his hand and spoke in a voice that carried across the suddenly quiet hangar, making sure everyone could hear what he was about to say. "Mr. Mitchell," Captain Reynolds said with obvious reverence, "I want to thank you for building the aircraft that has kept me alive through dozens of combat missions." The hangar fell completely silent as the younger mechanics realized what they were witnessing. The old man they had dismissed and mocked was actually the legendary Harold Mitchell, whose name appeared on patents and technical manuals throughout the aviation industry. The same hands they had criticized for being too slow and shaky had designed and built some of the most advanced aircraft systems ever created. Harold accepted the pilot's handshake with quiet dignity, showing no signs of anger or resentment toward the mechanics who had treated him poorly. He simply nodded and replied that he was glad his work had served its purpose. But Reynolds wasn't finished because he understood that this moment represented something larger than just a case of mistaken identity. This was about recognizing the contributions of the generation that had built the foundation for everything that followed. The pilot turned to address the entire hangar crew, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had risked his life in aircraft that Harold Mitchell had designed. He explained that they were in the presence of aviation royalty, someone whose innovations had influenced every modern fighter aircraft in service today. Mitchell's fly-by-wire system had been revolutionary when it was introduced, making aircraft more maneuverable and safer than anyone had thought possible. The computer-assisted controls that modern pilots took for granted had been Harold's brainchild, developed when such technology seemed like science fiction. Reynolds continued his impromptu speech, describing how Mitchell's designs had saved countless pilot lives by making aircraft more forgiving and responsive in combat situations. The stability augmentation systems that prevented dangerous spins, installs the precise control inputs that allowed for impossible maneuvers, the redundant backup systems that brought damaged aircraft home safely. All of these innovations could be traced back to Harold Mitchell's engineering genius. As the pilot spoke, the atmosphere in the hangar underwent a complete transformation. The young mechanics who had been dismissive and impatient now looked ashamed and embarrassed by their earlier behavior. They began to understand that they had been in the presence of a living legend, someone whose work had shaped their entire profession. The tools and systems they used every day, the procedures they followed, the safety protocols that protected pilots, all of these things existed because Harold Mitchell had spent his career pushing the boundaries of what was possible. Jake Morrison was the first to step forward, his face red with embarrassment as he approached Harold with obvious remorse. He apologized for his earlier comments and asked if Harold would be willing to share some of his knowledge about the aircraft systems. Sarah Chun quickly followed, asking specific technical questions about hydraulics design that she had been struggling with. Tommy Rodriguez wanted to know about engine integration challenges, while Marcus Webb inquired about weapons systems compatibility. Harold responded to their questions with the same patient thoroughness he had shown all morning. He explained design decisions that had been made decades earlier, describing the engineering challenges that had to be overcome and the innovative solutions that had been developed. He shared stories about test flights and prototype failures, about late nights in design labs and breakthrough moments when seemingly impossible problems suddenly had obvious solutions. His answers revealed the depth of knowledge and experience that the younger mechanics had completely missed. The transformation wasn't just about recognizing Harold's past achievements, it was about understanding that his apparent slowness had actually been precision and that his methodical approach represented decades of learned wisdom. When he had spent extra time examining components, he had been looking for specific failure modes that he knew from experience. When he had asked detailed questions about modern systems, he had been trying to understand how new technology interfaced with the fundamental principles he had established decades earlier. Reynolds watched this exchange with satisfaction because he understood that something important was happening. The younger generation was learning to respect the knowledge and experience of their elders, while Harold was being recognized for contributions that had shaped their entire industry. This was exactly the kind of mentorship and knowledge transfer that kept aviation advancing while honoring its history and traditions. The morning's work resumed with a completely different dynamic as Harold found himself surrounded by eager students rather than impatient colleagues. The young mechanics asked him to explain the reasoning behind various design decisions, to share his insights about potential problem areas, and to describe how different systems interacted in ways that weren't obvious from technical manuals. Harold responded with obvious pleasure, clearly enjoying the opportunity to share knowledge he had accumulated over a lifetime of innovative engineering. As the pre-flight inspection continued, Harold's methodical approach was no longer seen as an impediment, but as a masterclass in thoroughness. The younger mechanics watched carefully as he demonstrated inspection techniques that weren't taught in modern training programs, learning to look for subtle signs of wear and stress that computerized diagnostics might miss. They began to understand that his trembling hands were still guided by an intimate knowledge of aircraft systems that exceeded anything they had learned in school. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on anyone present because the same aircraft that had been the subject of routine maintenance was actually a living piece of aviation history. Harold's signature on the wing represented not just personal pride, but a connection to the golden age of aerospace innovation, when engineers like him had revolutionized flight through pure creativity and determination. The F-16 they were preparing for flight was a testament to his genius and the genius of his entire generation of aviation pioneers. Captain Reynolds completed his pre-flight inspection with Harold at his side, learning details about the aircraft that weren't available in any manual. Harold pointed out specific areas where stress typically developed, explaining why certain components were designed the way they were, and describing modifications that had been made over the years to address problems that had emerged during operational use. The pilot found himself gaining new insights into an aircraft he had flown hundreds of times, understanding it at a level he had never achieved before. As the time approached for the test flight, Reynolds asked Harold if he would like to watch from the control tower, where he could monitor the flight and see his creation perform the mission it had been designed for. Harold accepted the invitation with quiet satisfaction, clearly pleased to see his work continuing to serve its intended purpose decades after he had first envisioned it. The younger mechanics also requested permission to observe, understanding that they were witnessing something special. The flight itself was routine from a technical standpoint, but emotionally, it represented something extraordinary. As the F-16 lifted off and climbed into the desert sky, everyone watching understood that they were seeing the culmination of Harold Mitchell's life work. The aircraft that had been dismissed by some as outdated technology was performing with the same precision and reliability that Harold had built into it nearly half a century earlier. Every maneuver, every system activation, every successful completion of mission parameters validated the engineering decisions that Harold had made when the aircraft was just a concept on paper. From the control tower, Harold watched with obvious pride as Captain Reynolds put the aircraft through its paces, testing the upgraded systems against the fundamental design principles that Harold had established decades earlier. The fly-by-wire controls responded exactly as intended. The stability augmentation systems prevented any dangerous flight conditions, and the overall performance exceeded expectations, just as Harold had always known it would. When the aircraft returned safely to the runway, and taxied back to the hangar. Harold was surrounded by mechanics and technicians who wanted to continue learning from his experience. They asked about other aircraft he had worked on, about design challenges he had faced, and about innovations he had developed that might not be widely known. Harold answered their questions with obvious pleasure, clearly energized by their genuine interest in his work and their respect for his achievements. The day ended with Harold being invited to return as a consultant and mentor rather than just a routine maintenance worker. The hangar supervisor recognized that having someone of Harold's caliber and experience available was an invaluable resource for training younger mechanics and solving complex technical problems. The military contractor program that had originally assigned Harold to routine tasks quickly reassigned him to a position that better matched his extraordinary qualifications and experience. But perhaps the most important change was in the attitude of the younger mechanics, who had learned an invaluable lesson about judging people based on appearances and assumptions. They discovered that experience and wisdom don't always come in the packages they expect, and that the trembling hands of an elderly man might have built the very foundations of their profession. They learned to look beyond surface appearances to recognize the depth of knowledge and experience that older workers bring to their jobs. Harold Mitchell returned to work the following day with the same quiet dignity and methodical approach that had characterized his entire career. The difference was that now his colleagues understood exactly who they were working with and treated him with the respect and reverence he had always deserved. The young mechanics competed for opportunities to work alongside him, learning not just technical skills, but also the kind of professional pride and dedication that had made Harold one of aviation's greatest innovators. The story of Harold Mitchell's recognition spread throughout the aviation community, becoming a reminder that genius doesn't retire, it just takes on different forms. The same creativity and innovation that had revolutionized fighter aircraft design continued to influence and inspire a new generation of aerospace professionals. Harold's signature on the wing became a symbol not just of his personal contribution, but of the ongoing connection between aviation's pioneering past and its innovative future. Sometimes the most extraordinary people are hiding in plain sight, working quietly among us without seeking recognition or acclaim. Harold Mitchell had spent his entire career pushing the boundaries of what was possible in aviation design, creating innovations that saved countless lives and advanced the science of flight. But when his hands began to shake and his pace slowed down, people saw only an old man struggling with routine tasks rather than a genius whose work had shaped their entire world. The lesson learned in that desert hangar was about more than just recognizing individual achievement. It was about understanding that wisdom and experience take many forms and that we dismiss them at our own peril. The young mechanics who had mocked Harold's trembling hands discovered that those same hands had built the aircraft that protected pilots around the world. They learned that the methodical pace they had criticized was actually the careful, deliberate approach of someone who understood the life and death importance of getting every detail exactly right. In the end, Harold Mitchell didn't need their recognition or their apologies because he had always known the value of his work and the importance of his contributions. But the recognition meant something to the younger generation, who learned to see beyond surface appearances to appreciate the depth of knowledge and experience that surrounds them every day. They discovered that heroes don't always wear capes or seek the spotlight. Sometimes they wear coveralls and carry flashlights, working quietly to ensure that others can soar safely through the sky. This story was brought to you by Silent Salute. Before we leave you today, here's our question. Have you ever known someone who never asked for recognition, but deserved more than anyone else? Tell us in the comments what they meant to you and how you remember them. And if you think stories like this need to be heard, hit that subscribe button to support the channel. We'll see you in the next one.